Excellent. Well, welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It sounds like we've got someone who just joined who's on a telephone that is a little echoey. So if folks could do a *6 if you're on the phone to try to mute yourself, that would be great, because I'm definitely hearing an echo. Looks like one person on the phone was able to mute themselves. There we go. Excellent. Thank you very much, those of you on the phone. So welcome again. Thanks for joining us today. We have a couple hours with you here today with a break built in, which should be great. And we're going to use the chat box, which hopefully people have been able to find if you were on your computer. There should be a little call out button near the bottom that you can push, and the chat box will pop out on the side for you. Those of you who are on the phone, we apologize you don't have that feature with you today. And yeah, we're just excited you're here. I'd like to start with folks telling me in the chat box, where are you located today? And you can feel free to type in the chat box the town you're in, plus if you'd like the physical location you're in. So for instance, I'm in Essex Junction. I'm lucky enough to be able to be in my cozy little house, and I'm in my purple junk room. You can see a little bit of purple here behind me. I have this little junk room in my house that I carted everything out of and set up a little desk for myself for this strange, wild world we're in now. And I feel very lucky and fortunate. And I hope that you are all also in a nice, cozy place where you can join us today, distractions and all, to be a part of this webinar. So thank you, and thanks for letting me know where you guys are. Looks like we got a lot of people at home. Ooh, in front of the wood stove. Oh, sounds lovely. So yeah, feel free to continue to type in the chat box where you're located so that we can feel at least a little somewhat connected across time and space here. Excellent. All over the state. Sounds lovely, lovely, lovely. Hopefully, we have cats and dogs joining us, which is great. And if you've got your kids alongside you, all the better, because maybe they can help you with some of the trivia portions we have in this webinar today. So yeah. Thank you all. I love cats and dogs. As some of you who came on early were hearing me talk about my cat. I have a little cat. I have two cats, one named Nimbus and one named Nebula. They're brother and sister. They're very cute. At some point, I might get distracted hearing them whining outside my door as they want to come in this room where I've got the space heater and it's nice and cozy. Yesterday, I opened up the door and the little girl came running in and jumped on my office chair and claimed it for her own. So I'm sure some of you are experiencing that at home as well. So good morning. Our topics for today, we have quite a few we're going to try to get through. We might not get through all of them, but that is okay. We're going to talk a little bit about working with library trustees and public officials, because that is part of what governance and management is for library trustees. We're going to talk a little bit about the exciting world of open meeting law, which I don't say with complete sarcasm. There is a little bit of oddity in how government works and why we need something like open meeting law. And of course, we'll have a stretch break, and if you're like me, maybe a little bit of dancing in with that. We'll talk about what laws we should be thinking about and following as part of library governance and management. We'll talk about some examples of conflict of interest and why we should care about that as folks who take taxpayer money. And then if we can get to it, we'll talk a bit about strategic planning and community engagement. I've got a lot of resources at the end that folks can dive into on their own time. Those of you who have taken trainings with me before know that strategic planning and especially community engagement is definitely something that feeds my soul. So I could do a whole webinar just on that because I love that so much. So hopefully that works for you guys. Hopefully we can keep your attention for a couple hours. Again, thanks for joining us, and let's dive in. So our first topic, so those of you again on the phone, if you could do *6 to mute yourselves, that would be great. So the first topic is working with trustees and public officials. I like to start in my webinars, especially talking about library governance, looking at Vermont State Statute Title 22. That is where there's a link on the slide here. And again, those of you who are on the phone, you'll get these slides in an email. Everyone will, actually. But this link leads you right to Title 22, which is the title in state statute that gives libraries their power. But it also says, and on this slide I've highlighted in yellow, that the legislature declares that free public libraries are essential which I love that language. I love how inspiring that is. I never knew that until I started working at the state. Even when I was a library director, I didn't know that. So our legislature has enshrined it in state statute that the work that we do at our public libraries is essential, which seems a little funky with what's going on right now with the pandemic and everything. But in order for, basically what the legislature has said is that in order for a democracy to function properly, people need free access to information. And so it's important that free public libraries exist so that people can get that free, unfettered access to information so that they can be informed citizens. Also in Title 22, this is a screenshot of what it looks like if you go look up the Vermont state statutes online. And again, there's the link to it. And there are several different parts to the Vermont state statutes online. And there's a part for incorporated public libraries and a part for municipal public libraries. Those of you who are in joint school public libraries, it's a little bit different for you. But I'm hoping that folks know if they're municipal or incorporated. You may not know. In fact, even some library directors and trustees don't officially know. And so we always encourage people to figure this out, because which part of state statute applies to you depends upon whether or not you're municipal or incorporated. But basically, municipal public libraries are departments of the town, and the town established them at some point in the past during a town meeting with a vote from the taxpayers. So there should be, if you're a municipal public library or if you work for one, there should be in some past town meeting the record of the town voting to create this municipal department. If you're an incorporated public library, usually you're what's called a nonprofit 501c3 corporation, and you have a filing with the Secretary of State establishing that, and you have a 501c3 number with the federal government. The type of library you are is not determined by your sources of funding or by who owns your building. Those are two separate pieces. And the reason I point this out is that oftentimes when I ask people, are you incorporated or are you a municipal library, they'll say, well, we get money from the town. And both municipal and incorporated libraries get money from towns, usually. So again, it's not where your funding comes from or who owns the building you're located in. It's, again, whether or not you're registered with the Secretary of State as a nonprofit corporation or the town voted you into existence at a town meeting in the past. So keeping that in mind, those two different incorporated versus public libraries, it's really, when you start talking about library trustees and select boards, there are some divisions of power set up in Title 22, the state statute, and those divisions can sometimes create some tension or some weirdness for especially municipal libraries who are working with municipal select boards. There can be some wonkiness there because of the way state statute has set up the governance structure of public libraries. But I always say it's really important to remember that we're all in this together. We're all serving the same taxpayers. We're all serving the same citizens. And sometimes in the battle of wills or the power struggles or the personality conflicts that can happen in our small towns of Vermont, we can forget that we're all in this together. So oftentimes I will be working with directors and trustees to figure out how do we work better with the select board. I talk about that a lot, and I focus on this, we're all in this together concept. And but it's also important, even though we're all in this together, it's important to know the law of public libraries as set up in state statute Title 22. So in the municipal part of Title 22, it says that municipal library trustees shall have what they call full power to manage the public library. And on this slide, I've given you where you can find that language. That may have been moderated a bit depending on your town charter or how your library was established. But for most public libraries in Vermont that are municipal, the default is that the library trustees have full power to manage what happens to the library. And then with incorporated library trustees, it's a corporation they're running, so they have full power over the corporation. Now, again, there are some caveats depending on, especially for incorporated public libraries, if the municipality gives you a tax appropriation and they attach some things to it, that might change things a little bit. But again, it's important to remember that we're all in this together and that you have this delicate balance that you need to maintain and nurture between the library trustees and their funders. And some of their funders are going to be the select board of the taxpayers. So really thinking about that, those relationships are really important. That relationship building is an essential part of what library directors and trustees do. And so even now, during the time of the COVID pandemic, that it's even now you and your board, library trustees and directors should be reaching out to the select board, should be reaching out to their volunteers, should be reaching out to other stakeholders, donors, and really letting them know, how is the library still functioning and really serving its community despite the fact that your building may be closed. What services are you offering? Let them know you're still thinking about them. Ask them for advice on how they can stay connected with them or with you, and what services you could potentially be offering now in the future. All of that is really important to think about now during this time. And this is part of, I'm getting a little bit into my community engagement work too. So when you're thinking about all these folks, so you're thinking about the library itself. So stepping back from the outward facing and think about the inward facing. So you've got your trustees, you've got the director, and then you may have a friends group. And sometimes the roles and responsibilities in terms of the governance structure with all of these can get a little fuzzy. And so one of the handouts that Joy emailed you all who registered ahead of time is this sort of chart that talks about who does what and roles and responsibilities of these 3 different groups. But on a high level overview of that, the trustee board really is what I call the big picture or the forest viewers. They are really governing, they have the full power to govern the library. So they're really the governing structure of the library. And they ideally, if the library is functioning really well, are really thinking big picture. What's our strategic plan? What's our marketing plan? What's our advocacy plan? What are our policies? A bunch of big picture management stuff of the library institution. Whereas the director usually is more thinking about the trees, the daily operations. How are we serving our patrons? How are we making sure that everyone is safe? How are we making sure that the books and other materials that we're putting in our collection serve our strategic plan and serve the collection development policy that my trustees have put in place. And these two, the trustee board and the director, really are a partnership that work together for the health of the institution of the library. And so some of the big picture things that the trustees do, they really have to do in conjunction with the director, because those two together, the board and the director, can really, both the perspective of everyone on the board and the perspective of the director who has to implement things, those two things that really need to be working lockstep to make sure that the institution is functioning well. Now, the Friends group is a separate group from the library itself. Ideally, they're a 501c3 nonprofit. Not all Friends groups in Vermont are, but ideally they are. And so they've got their own board, their own way of doing things, but they really exist to support the library. And so oftentimes things work best when trustees and friends sit down and really talk through who does what, whose role is what. And in many towns or many libraries, they actually write in a memorandum of understanding, also known as an MOU, to really delineate that for people. And hopefully that handout that Joy sent to you via email with those 3 columns will help clarify how those roles in different areas are laid out. So I encourage you to look at that handout. And again, ideally all 3 work together. So the trustees set the strategic plan in conjunction with the director implements that strategic plan, and the friends really look at that plan when they decide what they're going to do and talk with the trustees and the director about what they would like to do as the Friends board and make sure that everything works well together. All right. Joy, I'm going to pause for a second. Have you gotten any questions so far that I should address, or should I just keep going?
I think you can keep going. I'm just trying to email the packet to someone who said they didn't get it, but I believe that's all that we are of question. Thanks for checking.
Great. And again, folks, if you have questions along the way, Joy will be helping me monitor the chat box, so feel free to put them in there. All right, so we're going to get a little bit interactive here because I have talked too much. And so this will be a challenge for everyone who has a computer, they're joined by a computer, to type in to the chat box some of the answers to this following quiz I'm going to give you. This is my open meeting law quiz. Some of you may know a little bit about open meeting law, but open meeting law really is one of the the items that we really need to follow as folks who get money from our local taxpayers, whether or not we're municipal or incorporated. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the purpose is and how to follow it. And before I start that, though, municipal libraries are required to follow open meeting law with their trustees. Incorporated public libraries are strongly recommended by us, here at the department, and by the Vermont Secretary of State, because they receive taxpayer money. So we are going to do a little test of your knowledge and your geekiness level, see if you guys can match my geekiness level. All right, so if any of you know, when does open meeting law apply? So when do library boards need to follow open meeting law? And Erica, I see a question there. We'll definitely get to that. So if you have a second to type into the chat box your guesses about when open meeting law might apply, go ahead and do that. Some of the future questions will actually be multiple choice. We have some good guesses so far. Yes, yes. Whenever there's a quorum is a guess. When meeting to discuss business is a guess. Whenever there's a meeting of more than 3 people, maybe. Yep. Yeah. You guys are smart. Yeah, well, you got it. Yes. So in the chat box, you guys have answered it. Absolutely. So it is when a quorum of the library board meets to discuss library business. Absolutely. Good work, you guys. You know it. And what quorum means really just depends on how many trustees you have and whether or not quorum is spelled out in the trustee bylaws, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So for those of you who have a trustee board of 5, usually a quorum is 3 people. And a quorum is usually defined as the majority of seats on the board. So this is getting a little bit into the weeds here, but so if you have 5 seats on your trustee board and you have only 4 people currently on the trustee board, usually your quorum is still 3 because it's a majority of the seats, not necessarily the people you have in the seats. So it's a little funky there. It's not always the same, but whenever you have a majority of them coming together to discuss library business, then you have a quorum. Open meeting law also talks about official committees. That's a little bit more funky and harder to define. When I get questions about that, I talk more about are they an official committee or are they an ad hoc committee? But I don't want to focus on that too much. I just put this up here because it's part of the actual law. But the focus is when you have a quorum of your board coming together to actually talk about library business, they should be following the dictates of open meeting law. All right, next one. What is the point of open meeting law? So anyone have any guesses? Why does open meeting law exist? Why should we be following these laws, details that I'm about to test you on? Anne says transparency. Yep. Bridget says so the public can have input. Yep. There we go. You two got it right off the bat. Yes, the public is informed as what's going on at the library. Yes. So it is to give the public a fair, as the law says, to give the public a fair and open opportunity to participate in discussions of and decisions made by their government. Because they are giving this institution part of their money, they need to be allowed to participate and be part of the decision-making process. But also, as some of you said, to make government more transparent. Absolutely. So if you are an organization, yes, as Erica said, if you're an organization getting money from the taxpayers, you need to be accountable to those taxpayers in some way. And by following open meeting law and really making everything open so that people can see how they're spending the money that they've given you, you are sort of allowing them to trust what you're doing. You're making sure they realize you have nothing that you're hiding. You want to make sure they can see your books, see the decisions that you're making. And this applies, honestly, I mean, open meeting law really is governed around taxpayer money, if you're getting taxpayer money. But I always say to organizations, even if you're getting donor money, you might want to be as open as possible because you want the donors to be able to see that you're spending their money wisely and you're not doing anything nefarious with the money that they've given you. All right. So here's where the multiple choice part comes in. So you guys can type into the chat which of these answers you think is correct. So the question is, agendas for regular meetings must be posted. Here are your choices. Whenever they're ready, 24 hours in advance, 48 hours in advance, 1 week in advance? Go ahead and take a guess. This is for regular trustee meetings. All right. We have a variety of opinions in the chat box. Very good, very good. It looks like the majority of you are changing your votes back and forth, but the majority of you are voting for 48 hours in advance, and you are correct. So for regular meetings, these are meetings that, your monthly trustee meetings, agendas for those regular meetings must be posted 48 hours in advance. Congrats for those of you who got that right. Gold star. All right, here's the next one. Agendas for special meetings. So these are meetings that aren't your regularly monthly meeting, but maybe the trustees didn't get through all of their agenda on the regular meeting, but they really need to meet again before their next regular meeting. So they schedule a special meeting to continue to talk about a certain topic. Agendas for special meetings must be posted. Here's your multiple choice. They don't need to be posted 24 hours in advance, 48 hours in advance, 1 week in advance. Go ahead and guess. Some people think the same. A couple votes for 24 hours, a couple votes for 48 hours or a week. Yep, guys are doing good. So the answer to this one is 24 hours in advance. So those of you who guessed 24 hours, gold star. Yes, these don't have to be posted, do not have to be posted as far in advance as regular meetings, but you do need to give the public a heads up that you're going to meet and have an agenda that clearly lets them know what you're going to talk about. Good job.
Laura, excuse me a second.
Yes.
There was a question in the chat. Is posting the agenda the same as warning the meeting?
No. So warning the meeting is just letting folks know when you're going to meet. So you could be, oftentimes they're done at the same time, honestly. But the agenda is, some people might say they're the same, so I shouldn't say that they're two different things. But the agenda really is a very detailed list of the topics you're going to talk about. So not only have you warned people that you're meeting, you've let them know what you're going to talk about so that it's very clear so people can make the choice whether or not they want to join you based on the agenda that you've set. And we're going to talk a little bit about agendas too as we go forward. How specific do they need to be? That sort of thing. Yeah, good question. Are there any others?
Yes. Then how far in advance does the meeting need to be warned?
It's a really great question. I've actually never looked that up. I assumed that the warning was the same as the agenda, that you need to let people know, again, at least for a regular meeting, at least 48 hours in advance. But I'm going to write down warnings. How far in advance? And I will look that up because that's actually a really great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I do know it has to be at least 48 hours in advance because that's when you're posting the agenda for regular meetings. Yeah. All right. Good questions. I like this. I like it when I get questions I don't know the answer to. All right. So agendas for emergency meetings don't need to be posted. True or false? Go ahead and put your guess in the chat. Almost everyone is voting false, which amuses me because the answer is true. Agendas for emergency meetings do not need to be posted. That is true because emergency meetings should be very, very rare. They should only be for situations requiring immediate attention where the trustees must come together to address something immediately. So remember, special meetings, you only need to give people a minimum of 24 hours advance notice. So if you can give people 24 hours advance notice, that is the ideal, at least that for the special meetings. If you have an emergency meeting like, oh my God, the library is flooding, all the trustees need to get here, we need to make a decision now, you don't need to warn the public that's happening. You just, because what needs to happen is the trustees need to get together as soon as possible, immediately to deal with an emergency. So again, emergency meetings should be very, very rare. And you should really, if someone just says they need to call an emergency meeting, the rest of the trustees should really push back and say, are you sure? Do we need to meet right now, or can we meet 24 hours or more later so that we can actually warn the public? All right. Next one. There's more than one right answer to this one. Agendas should be posted in which of the following locations? I'm going to give you some choices. On a website, at the grocery store, at the post office, at municipal offices, at the library, and at the school. Which of these do you think agendas should be posted? Where do you think agendas should physically be posted? Which of these locations? We have one vote for the website. Someone says wherever it says in the town plan, website, municipal offices, another website vote. Yeah. Library. Yep. Yep. Excellent. Yeah, you guys know your stuff. I wish, see, if we were meeting in person right now, I would be giving out lots of little treats to you guys because you guys are doing a great job. But yes, so agendas need to be posted on a website that is designated by the municipal board, so the select board, at the municipal offices, and 2 other places designated by the municipal board. So your agendas for your library trustee meetings should be posted where the select board tells you they should be posted. So the town's website, if your town has a website, it should definitely be there. And it may be that for the library trustee agendas, the town website just redirects people to the library website. That's fine. They need to be at the municipal offices, absolutely. And then any other, the select board should have, by state law, designated 2 other places where all of the boards and commissions have to post their agendas. And so you'll want to check with your town clerk or check with the select board to figure out where those should be. If you're an incorporated public library, it's still good to talk to the town clerk and say, hey, we're trying to follow open meeting law. Where do your boards and commissions of the town post their agendas? We'd like to do that as well. If you're an incorporated public library, you can say the town clerk or whoever manages the website, would you be willing to put a link on your website to link people to our website where we post our agendas? Something like that. But yes, so it's actually 4 places. On a website, which is not a physical location, but on a website, and then physically at the municipal offices, and 2 other places, one of which may be the library. When I was the library director, our library was one of those locations where everyone needed to post. Yep, great. Good work, you guys. Okay, another true or false. According to open meeting law, meeting minutes are public records. True or false? What do you think? Yeah, everyone's voting true, and you are so correct. So the caveat to this, knowing this is important, but also knowing what it means is really important, which means that these trustee meeting minutes must be kept in perpetuity and be available for access when requested by a member of the public. So that means wherever you store them, you have to store them for forever. And if anyone requests to access them, you need to be able to give them access. And for those of you who are thinking long-term sustainability of where you post them, that should raise some questions for you about, if you're only posting them on your website, that could be a problem if your website goes down, because then the minutes are no longer accessible. So how do you store things so that they're always accessible, even if the website goes down or the building burns down? Thinking about that is an important part of preservation for us. All right. So another multiple choice. The meeting minutes must be available within 5 business days, within 5 calendar days, within 7 business days, or within 7 calendar days. Which do you think? Got a couple votes for 5, 3 votes for 5 business days. Someone voted one of the above, yes. All right, so this is going to be a learning point for most of you who voted. The answer to this currently is 5 calendar days, which is important to know. This may end up changing at some point in the future, but currently open meeting law says 5 calendar days, which is important to know because if you're meeting with the trustees on a Friday afternoon, that Saturday and Sunday count as days that are ticking off when you need to post that agenda or those meeting minutes. So again, it's important to know it's 5 calendar days after the meeting ends. Within that, you have to get those meeting minutes available. And that could mean however you make them available. It could mean that you're posting them on your website if that's what you normally do. It could mean that you have them available and printed in a filing cabinet. But after that 5 business day marker happens, if any member of the public asks to see them, they should already be available. And these are draft minutes. These are not finalized minutes. So your secretary of your trustee board has written up some draft minutes, and they have to be draft minutes because in order to make them official minutes, the trustees have to vote on them at their next meeting. So they're going to remain draft minutes until the trustees vote to finalize them, and then you replace your draft posting with the final posting.
Hey, Laura, may I ask a question?
Absolutely.
This is Jen Ryan. I'm just, if memory serves, I think currently under the, COVID-19 special accommodations, the Secretary of State has relaxed the open meeting law for the time being in terms of how long period before the minutes legally have to be posted. Is that right?
That is right. I don't know the details of that, but I believe that you're correct in that. Yes, and they should have some details on their website around that. But yes, I believe you're right.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. And what I've been mainly focused on with COVID-19 changes is the fact that the Secretary of State has allowed people to meet online, which is great, and they've relaxed the requirement to have a physical location, which is also great because that enables social distancing to also happen. So there is some weirdness with open meeting law right now of them trying to make it safer for people to follow open meeting law, and all of those details are on the Secretary of State's, Vermont Secretary of State's website. Absolutely. Okay, so someone wrote, what if your board secretary takes lousy minutes? Yes, so we're going to get to what has to be in minutes shortly, so we'll get to that. Yep. Which is actually the next slide. What must minutes include? So the law makes it so that the minutes actually don't need to have a lot in them. So minutes must include the names of all the board members who are present and any active participants. So if you, for some reason, had several members of the public show up to your meeting, but they didn't say anything, you wouldn't necessarily have to include their names in the meeting minutes. But if they participate in any way, if they speak, you should definitely have their name in the meeting minutes. And then the only other thing minutes have to include is all motions that are made by the trustees, any proposals that are made, any resolutions that are made, and the results of all votes. But according to open meeting law, those are the only things that need to be in your meeting minutes. Whether or not there's anything else really depends on the practice of your board. So as part of your bylaws or as part of your operating procedures for the trustee board, there should be some agreement as to how detailed you guys want the meeting minutes to be. Now, they should, what it says in the law is that it should give some general idea of what's happened in the meeting, but it doesn't need to be a transcript. In fact, it shouldn't be a transcript, but it should allow the public, if they're reading the meeting minutes, say that 5 times fast, to get some general sense as to what was talked about. And then specifically, the public needs to know what votes were taken and the results of those votes. And then any motions or proposals or resolutions. So there should be, again, some general summary of what was happening, but how detailed that summary is really depends on the practice of your board and whether or not board members ask specific things to be put in the minutes beyond what the law says.
Laura, this is Joy. Can I just add that just to clarify the distinction between meeting notes can be much more extensive than that, and you probably would want them to be so that the board itself and the library director can go back and look at them, the people who are at the meeting, but the minutes don't have to have everything in them that the notes have.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So one of the questions we get a lot is what can we do in executive session? An executive session is the part of the meeting where the public is not allowed to attend unless they're invited to attend. And usually executive session is just the trustee board. So no one else, the director can be invited, and anyone else that the trustees think is important to be part of the session can be invited. But executive session is only allowed for very specific reasons, and these are all laid out in state statutes. One of those reasons could be personnel issues. One of them could be real estate transactions. One of them could be contract discussions, those sort of things. So these are the things that really have a sense of confidentiality around them and really need to be kept private. These aren't things you think should be kept private. These are things that legally need to be kept private. And so, again, I invite folks to go into the state statute on open meeting law and look at them. I can't remember how many exceptions you can use for public, or how many reasons you can go into executive session, but there are very few of them. But there's a process for it, and I just want to go through this really quickly because, again, we're getting into the weeds a little bit here. But basically, a trustee needs to make a motion where they state the reason they want to go in and then state the statutory provision that allows them to go into executive session. A majority of the trustees need to vote in to affirm that motion and say, yes, we're going to go in. The chair of the trustees then asks the public to exit the meeting. And then the board can invite folks to stay, legal counsel, staff, any people who need to stay for the part of the discussion. And then inside the executive session, they only discuss the issue that they went into executive session for, and they only discuss it. They cannot make any decisions. All decisions need to be made in public. Only discuss the subject matter they went into. That was part of the motion. And then when they're done discussing, they have to vote, or they have to exit executive session. And then if they want to make a vote, then they can do that in the open meeting again, where they invite the public back in. All right, so that was just a really brief overview of executive session. I'm ready for you guys to vote again. So I'm going to do a series of yes or no questions with you. So you can go ahead and type in the chat box again. And the questions revolve around, can or should you discuss the following topics as a trustee board and as a director with the trustee board over a group email or a group text. And what I mean by group email or group text is anything that involves more than a quorum of your trustees. All right, so the first topic is items to go on an agenda for an upcoming meeting. Is it okay for you to discuss those in a group email or text? You're all saying yes, and you're absolutely right. Yes, absolutely. Item agendas, you guys can talk in group emails about, okay, what are we going to put on the agenda? Okay, these are the items. So you can build your agenda over email, absolutely. About when you're going to meet, so meeting dates and times. Can you talk about that over group email or text? Majority of you got this? Yes, that is also yes. Because again, you're just doing administrative stuff. You're just getting everyone together over email to say, when are we meeting again and what time? So if you want to establish the time you're meeting and the basic agenda, you can do both of those over email. Yeah. How about how you or a trustee might vote on an agenda item? Can you talk about those in a group email or text? You guys are good. Excellent. You're all saying no, and you're absolutely right. Because once you start talking about how you might vote on an agenda item, now you're starting to conduct business. And again, if you do it over a group email or over text, the public cannot be a part of that discussion. So you're violating open meeting law by doing that. All right, how about what you should add to the budget? All right, you guys are doing well. Exactly. You should not be discussing that over a group email or text. How about how the annual appeal letter should be worded? This one you're not all in agreement on, which, see, the examples are getting harder now. This is also a no, because the annual appeal letter with a majority, again, if you're thinking about a group, a majority of the board, so a quorum of the board, that is library business. And even if it's an official committee, that could be argued that that's library business. So if you have an ad hoc committee, or if you have just a couple members of the board and maybe some members of the public, you might be able to argue that you could talk about that over email, but that's a little bit trickier one. I think I've got one more. How policies should be modified. So can the trustee board start talking about how they should modify policies over a group email with everyone in the reply all mode? Yeah, you guys are good. That's also a no. Yeah, there is a way that you can talk about how policies should be modified over email, but it really should be one-on-one communication. It should not be a group email. And trustees often ask me this, and I'll say, well, how about if the director or someone who's been appointed by the board sends out the policy and everyone sends modifications to that one person, not to each other, but just to that one person. That one person collates everybody's thoughts, puts them into a document, and then at the meeting, everyone looks at all of those ideas together in an open meeting. That's okay. But having actual substantive discussion over email on any item of library business is a big no-no, because again, the public can't participate in a group email. All right, so we've got some questions. So Joe asks me if I know of any public libraries of Vermont who have had their actions for clear to open meeting law. Yes, I can't give out specifics, but yeah, and there is in open meeting law, there is there's procedures for how that happens. Basically, it involves a member of the public filing a complaint with the Secretary of State's office, and then the Secretary of State's or with the SelectBoard. And they let the Public Library Board know that there's been a complaint, and there's a certain turnaround time that the Library Board has to address that complaint publicly, respond to it. And I don't know all the details of that, but that is all set out in state statute. The Secretary of State can help you with that. If you're part of a municipal library, you can talk to the Select Board about that procedure, or you can even talk to the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. They can help you with that. But yeah, there is a procedure set in for that with penalties. Yeah. Are there any legitimate emails? Oh, are the legitimate emails discoverable by public record? Absolutely. So that's a really great question. So the trustee emails that are being exchanged with each other or with the library director that are talking about library business are also public records. So that's something for you to talk to your trustees about, especially if they're using their personal email to conduct trustee business. It's just something to be aware of and to talk about, because if they don't have a dedicated email for trustee business, if you get an open meeting, an open records request, they're going to have to sort through all of their personal and trustee emails and try to figure out the stuff they need to respond with. So that's one of those things, one of those discussions to have with your trustees around what email address are you using? Is that easy to sort out all of your trustee emails if we get a public records request? Absolutely. So Lisa asks, sharing the appeal letter for final revisions before it goes to the printer is a no-no. Well, it depends on how you do it, Lisa. So if you send it out and you say, okay, the board, well, what should happen, honestly, is the board should vote on the final appeal letter. That's what should actually happen. So before it goes to the printer, there should be one last either special or regular meeting where the whole board looks at the letter and everyone signs off on how it's written. That's really what should happen. Joy, did I miss any questions in the chat, or did I get them all?
You got them all.
Great.
But I have one. Can you talk a little bit about if the friends of the library are doing the appeal letter, and does that all of this apply to them in the same way?
So the friends, it doesn't apply to them the same way as it does to the trustee board, because again, open meeting law applies because the libraries are receiving taxpayer funds, appropriated taxpayer funds through town meeting votes. So the friends shouldn't be, I mean, maybe they are, but most friends groups, I haven't actually heard of any friends groups in Vermont that get appropriated taxpayer funds from town meeting. If they did, then yes, they should also be following open meeting law. And we had a question earlier about a public library that gets no taxpayer appropriated funds. And there are a couple of those in Vermont. And I encourage those libraries to still follow open meeting law so that their donors know that they're being really open about how the money is being spent. Yeah, if you're an incorporated public library, you're not required by law to follow open meeting law, but we highly encourage you to. And the Secretary of State has said that over and over and over again to me. You really need to push for these incorporated public libraries to do the best they can to follow open meeting law. Absolutely. And so this last slide on open meeting law is about the unintended meeting, which happens a lot when you discuss problems and solutions in library business over email or text, when you have a quorum of people present, or back in the days before the pandemic when we all gathered at places. If you have a small library board of 5 people and 2 of them are at a party and they can talk about library business, but as soon as a third person of the trustee board joins that conversation, they need to police themselves and stop talking about library business because at that point they've got a quorum. All right, so I'm just going to put up this last slide about open meeting law. And for those of you who are on the phone, so the basic requirements of open meeting law are actually not all that complicated. You just need to let people know you're meeting, create and post an agenda, conduct your business in open meeting. Allowing for public comment is part of what needs to be part of your agenda because the public has a right to comment in a meeting. You need to record and post minutes, respond to any open meeting law violation complaints that you receive. And then there are a couple other things, like if you have some people who are participating electronically and some people who are present and you take a vote on something and everyone doesn't vote the same way, current open meeting law says that you need to vote by name and record everyone's individual vote. Again, we're not going to worry about that too much, but you can find details about that on the Secretary of State's website, even though it's kind of funky right now with the pandemic adjustments, and then follow executive session rules. So really it's let people know when you're going to meet, let them know what you're going to talk about, and then let them know what you talked about. That's the majority of open meeting law right there. Guess what? Oh, someone has a question before our stretch and dance break. All right, I'm going to go back a slide. Here we go. Could you clarify about draft and voted on minutes? When, where, how? Yes. So, let's say we're meeting today. So today is Thursday, the 23rd. We've had a secretary taking minutes in our meeting today. Those draft meeting minutes must be posted or available anyway by Tuesday. And they're draft meeting minutes because the trustees have not had a chance to vote on them yet. So you need to have some sort of guidelines set up with your secretary that, maybe they have one other person look over them before they get posted, however you want to do it. But they're draft and they need to be completely posted in a way that makes it obvious to people that these are draft meeting minutes. Either it's the title or they have a watermark that says draft, whatever. And they need to be posted by Tuesday. That's five calendars from now. Whenever the trustees meet next, one of the first items on their agenda is going to be to review the draft minutes. So let's say the trustees meet on the 7th of May. So the meeting minutes have been posted, the draft meeting minutes have been posted on the 28th of April. The trustees meet again on the 7th of May and they look at those draft and they modify them if they need to. If they like how it is, they vote, they make them official. And then that official copy replaces the draft copy, either online or in your file. And then those should be marked official or voted on minutes or whatever. Hopefully that clarifies. And the public should know, again, that's why you need to make it very clear that the draft minutes are draft, so the public knows that some of this wording might get changed if at the next meeting the trustees go, actually, it's not what we said, or that sort of thing. Hopefully that helps a little bit. All right, so with that question answered, it's time for a stretch and dance break. Those of you who've seen me or know me know that I like to dance. So I encourage you all to take a couple minutes. Let's say it's 10:52 according to my computer. So let's say at 10:55, I'm going to start us up again. Until then, feel free, please stretch, please get up. I'm going to turn my monitor off or my camera off so you can't see me because I'm going to stretch and do a little dance. But please give yourself a couple minutes to get your body a little bit stretched. So we will reconvene at 10:55. 10:55. Alexa. All right. Hopefully some of you enjoyed that little dance music and you're fans of Justin Timberlake like I am. I don't know how you listen to that song and not dance. Welcome back, everyone. All right. Thanks for sticking with me. We made it through pretty much hour one of this. I have some hard questions coming up for you, well, especially when we start getting into the conflict of interest section of today. Hopefully that'll give you some big picture questions to ponder, and I am pretty certain that we won't all agree, which is actually part of what makes conflict of interest so challenging. But before we talk about that, I have a little slide here. This is the only slide I have on bylaws, but bylaws, again, they're part of governance and management, so it's important just to have an awareness that they exist. Bylaws are pretty much the laws that the trustees write for themselves to guide how they operate. And they cover a wide range of things. If you go to our website and look for our trustee manual or our trustee handbook, we have a page in there about what should be in bylaws. And I think we have some bylaw examples on our website too. And basically they cover things like how many trustees are on your board, how long are their terms, do they have term limits, what are the officers, what is a quorum, do they follow Robert's Rules of Order, or do they follow things like parliamentary rules, all sorts of things like that. So, so trustee bylaws should be fairly, I mean, they could be only 2 pages, but I like them when they're a little bit longer because if they're really short, they oftentimes don't cover all the things they need. If you are curious about your trustees bylaws and whether they should be updated, you can always feel free to email them to me or to Joy, and we can look them over and give you some suggestions for sections that might be missing. But again, you can also look at our trustee manual and look at all the sections that are detailed there and compare those to what your bylaws say. They're important to review regularly because you don't want to get into a situation where you realize that your library trustees are violating their own bylaws. That has happened in Vermont. And the scary thing about that is that once, depending on the violation, you could invalidate a lot of the work that the trustees have done if they're not following their own bylaws. So it's important to look at those fairly regularly. I usually encourage them to be looked at least once a year. You know, especially every time you get new trustees on board, the whole board should be looking at those bylaws again. So Eric asked, is there any kind of timeline for when they should be looked at or for possible updating? Are you thinking, Eric, are you thinking bylaws or are you thinking meeting minutes? Go ahead and put that in the chat. And bylaws, okay, yeah. So I think, like I said, I think bylaws should be looked at once a year, honestly, maybe at your annual meeting. If you're an incorporated public library, yeah, you should look at those because you want to make sure that they're actually being followed and that everyone's committed to those bylaws. And if they're out of date, you know, to go through the updating process as part of the governance work of the trustees. All right. So laws that govern your work. That is another one of the handouts that Joy sent to folks ahead of time. This is like a 3-page handout and it covers a variety of laws. And there are lots of them that govern our work. And so it's worth looking over those laws. And this handout is actually also on our website, which may be an easier way to look at it because then you can just click on the links and it'll bring you to where the law is rather than trying to type in all those laws. But basically the handout covers state laws. There are a lot of Vermont laws that apply to the work that we do. It's important to know them. Things like patron privacy law is really important. Things like the Vermont wine and beer law, if you'd like to think about having wine and beer at some of your library events, those sort of things. So that's important, and open meeting law and Title 22. So those are all in the state law section. There may be some local laws that apply to you, again, depending on your library structure, depending on how you were set up. It's something to think about. There are definitely federal laws that apply to you, whether you're municipal or incorporated. These are things like federal labor law, OSHA, those sort of things, sexual harassment law, all those sort of things are really important to you. And it's important to know about them because some of them apply to you even if you're hiring new people. Even the applicants to your library, for your library positions, are covered by some of these laws. So it's important to review those. And then at the end of the handout, I have a bunch of guidelines that are important to know about, especially the ALA, or the American Library Association guidelines. Those are really, really important for you and your trustees to review regularly, because you guys are working together to create policy. You want to make sure that the library policies you create don't inadvertently violate some of the American Library Association guidelines, because those guidelines really are the philosophical underpinnings to the work that we do. And that's where most trustee boards get into trouble. They send me a potential policy review or revision, and I'll look at them and I'll send them back a link to like the ALA access statements and go, it seems to me like this policy is creating barriers to access, and one of the big things about library service is that we try to eliminate those barriers. So why is this barrier that you're putting up in this policy really important to your library? What's the business justification for this for this barrier that seems to fly in the face of what libraries exist for? So thinking about that is really important. I'm not going to go much deeper into those because we could do a whole section on that, but that's why I wanted you to have this handout. All right, hopefully you're ready for some challenging questions. I'm going to give you a series of conflict of interest scenarios that I'd like you to think about as we go through each one. We're not all going to agree on this. And I will give you some of my opinions or insights, because these are all based on questions I've received as over my 3+ years of work here at the department. And again, it's important to realize that we at the department we cannot give you legal advice, and we're not lawyers. And conflict of interest questions oftentimes rotate around legal advice type questions. And so when people ask me these, what I'll say to them is, well, I can't tell you what to do. We at the state are advisors to you. All of the libraries are individually governed. So you guys make decisions based on what's best for you and your community. We have no direct jurisdiction over you. But from my experience working at the state and things I've seen, you might want to consider A, B, C, D. Because again, I might see things, or might know of court cases, or might have talked to the Secretary of State or the Attorney General about certain issues, and you might just want to be aware of these things. Now, conflict of interest is defined mainly by a trustee or a staff member benefiting personally or financially from their position. And again, it's important to realize it's both personal and financial. So even if you're not making any money, if there's a personal benefit that you're getting from your position, that could be seen as a conflict of interest. Now, why should you care? Well, again, it goes back to you're getting taxpayer and donor money to run your institution. And if the taxpayers or the donors have any reason to suspect that their money is being used inappropriately or unethically, that threatens the long-term health of your institution. It means that, if enough taxpayers get riled up by a conflict of interest situation, then it's possible that they will vote against your library next year, or donors might stop donating. And so it's important to not only avoid conflict of interest scenarios, but also to avoid the appearance of conflict of interest. Because even if it's clear to you and the board that a certain situation is not a conflict of interest, you need to be able to clearly articulate that, because the taxpayers may not see it that way. All right. Hopefully that sets the stage for some of these questions. All right. So number one, I'm going to read these out loud because I know some of you, I know that you can read, but some of you are on the phone, so I want you to be able to hear this part. So is this a conflict of interest? The Board of Trustees needs to hire an accountant to help with the library's payroll, tax filings, etc. The brother of Jim, who is a library trustee, Jim is, works at a local accounting firm, and Jim tells the board that they can trust this firm to do a good job. The board decides to hire that firm. Is this a conflict of interest? What do you think? Go ahead and type your thoughts into the chat box. Aha, good, good, good. So I'm seeing a lot of yeses, and I'm seeing some folks write out the reasoning too, which is good. Yep, good, good. Yeah, so 3 or 4 of you have said yes, but only if there's no sort of bidding process or if they haven't considered other firms. Absolutely. And that's the crux of this that I tend to point out to people. This happens a lot. Situations like this happen a lot. We're in small towns. We know each other. We work on reputations and who knows who. And it's really common for board members when facing a decision to say, hey, why don't we just hire this person over here? I know them, or I'm related to them. And what makes this particular example kind of funky is that the person who's being recommended is actually related to a board member, closely related. And so there could potentially be a conflict of interest case here. Someone could say, well, Jim got his brother hired. The board didn't consider other firms. So Jim's benefiting personally, even if he's not getting any money. He's helping out his family member. So he's benefiting personally from this situation and from his role on the board. So there we go. So, but if the board has a vetting process, an RFP process, or some process they go through where they consider a bunch of different firms and they consider them all on the same footing, that can help mitigate the conflict of interest accusations. And especially if you're a municipal library, you should check with your town to see what their vetting process is. What is their process for hiring firms for anything? And it behooves you and the board to study that policy and follow it as a department of the town. All right, good job with that one. How about this one? The library director is out on medical leave for 3 months. One of the trustees is available to serve as interim director, and the board decides to hire that trustee for the 3 months at a pay rate similar to what the library director is paid. Is this a conflict of interest? Yes or no? And do you have any ideas as to why or why not it might not be? Looks like everyone said yes so far. Yeah. Yep. Someone's saying it's not an open hiring process. The trustees can't be hired. There needs to be a process. Yep. Trustee would need to be removed from the board. Might be okay then. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, the trustee would basically hire themselves in this, right? So you've got some good reasoning going on there, some really good critical thinking, which I applaud you guys for. This situation happens a lot in Vermont. And so when this happens, I advise people, similar to what you guys are saying, that there are some issues here. That the trustee would basically be hiring themselves, they're not opening it up, trustees shouldn't be paid. Absolutely, all of these are correct. And so what I oftentimes say to trustees is, well, is there a way that you can go about this process to allow the trustee to get hired if the trustee really is the best candidate? First of all, how do you know the trustee is the best candidate? And if they are, because trustees should not be benefiting personally or financially from their position on the board, would you like to consider potentially having that trustee resign and then become the director? And then afterwards, do you want to rehire or reappoint the trustee? You know, it's something to really be thought through. Also keep in mind, well, what if the trustee isn't getting paid? What if they're just volunteering to be the director? And again, that sets up some weirdness. Yeah, Wendy says, can the trustee fill in for no payment? And I think that could work, but you really have to work with the trustees to figure out how they're going to make that work. Because then you're taking a colleague, an equal, and you're making them a subordinate of the board for a specific amount of time. And how is that relationship going to work? When that trustee member becomes a trustee again, if they do, how is that going to affect their relationship with the director? When the director comes back, you know, you really need to think through all this and figure out what's good for the town, what's good for the institution. You know, really, again, the details of this are going to be specific to your situation, but really thinking through this and not making assumptions and having explicit conversations about this is really important. And Bridget says you're not supposed to have a volunteer cover a paid position. Yeah, so that's another thing to think about. You know, is it different if it's a trustee? You know, really be thinking about that, because if you say to the town and to the taxpayers, you know what, we're going to have a volunteer cover this position for this amount of time, are you then telling the taxpayers that you don't need a paid person in this position? And do you want to be telling them that? So really be thinking about all of those points. Good. All right, how about this one? The library wants to offer yoga classes, and one of the trustees is a yoga teacher. That trustee offers to teach the yoga classes at the library for a reduced rate. Is this a conflict of interest? This is a really hard one. Yeah, we're not all in agreement on this one, right? Yeah, it's challenging because, you know, I've had this one come to me several times or something similar to it, and the questions that you guys are asking absolutely are the questions that we have to talk about. How does it benefit the patrons? How does it benefit the library? Could the trustee do it for free? Is the library competing with a local business, and is that a problem? Thinking about all these things. Is there another way that it could happen? These are all important things to think about because this is really complex. Should the trustee be getting paid for doing anything for the library? That's a really tricky one, especially if it's the trustee's main business. But if it's the trustee's main business, should they be offering that at the library because then they've got an in, and are they promoting their business? Yeah, it's all a lot of weirdness. Or could they, rather than charging the library, could the friends maybe pay the trustee, rather so that there's not any budget money from the taxpayers going to this person, or donor money? Yeah, so it's hard to think about, but you guys are all raising really good points. And again, it's not clear cut, and it's not necessarily a conflict of interest, but it might be. And so again, the appearance is part of what we're dealing with here. Okay, got a couple more, I think. The local historical society learns that you, the library director, know a lot about cataloging and getting things ready to put into a cataloging system. They want recommendations on what system they should use to catalog their collection and training on how to catalog. They offer to hire you at $15 an hour to work with them. Is this a conflict of interest? Yeah, we are not all in agreement on this one either. This is another weird one. It's another really weird one. And I think this is one where you definitely would want to talk with your trustees about it, because it may not be a conflict of interest. You may be able to do it on your own time and get paid, and that should be fine. But as Joe just put in, it may be forbidden by your contract or by town regulations. Yep. You may have a moonlighting clause in your town personnel policy if your library follows the town personnel policy. You may even have a moonlighting clause in your own personnel policy. Basically, that means that you can't, you have to disclose any other jobs you have and discuss them as to whether or not they're going to be a conflict of interest prior to accepting those jobs. Yeah, so this one is a funky one, but getting paid to do it during library hours would likely be a no-no, because then you're double dipping. Whether or not you can do it on your own time, again, is something to look into. But this was actually something that happened to me when I was a library director. I had a local senior center offer to pay me to help them do this. And it was an interesting conflict of interest discussion I had with my trustees. All right, this might be the last one. The select board has an opening, and people in the community are encouraging you, the library director, and or one of your library trustees to run for the select board. Is that a conflict of interest? So that would mean that you'd be both a library director and a select board member, or a library trustee and a select board member at the same time. I like, Anne said, yes, who has that much time? Good. Yeah, so there are some dependencies on here, absolutely. And believe it or not, there are lots of libraries in Vermont where library people associated with the library, directly associated with the library, are also on the select board. So it depends on how you're going to manage that relationship. The libraries that I've talked to who have this talk about how challenging that is. Especially if you're a library trustee and a select board member, how do you vote on things on the select board when you're a library trustee? How do you separate that out? How do you have discussions without wearing the right hat? All that sort of stuff. So this is something that I discourage folks from doing, but I also know the folks who are doing it see some real benefits to it. So it's something to really think about in your town, and to really figure out and work with. Yeah, Jean Carr is on it. She's both. Yep. And for you to be really explicit with the select board and with the trustees about how these roles are going to work and how you're going to make sure that you wear the right hat. And I think we all wear multiple hats in our small towns of Vermont, and I think it's kind of necessary in some small towns. So figuring out how to wear these multiple hats is part of the conflict of interest dance, and it's part of making sure that that you properly govern and manage an important institution like a public library. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge. All right, before we move forward with strategic planning, I want to see, Joy, if you think I've missed anything in the chat, because I haven't been watching it very closely.
You're doing great. I think you've answered everything.
Excellent. And I just want to say thank you for all of you who are responding in the chat and really pointing out some of the issues that we're dealing with here. These are really complex topics we're talking about. That's why I love the idea of, that's why I love this class. I love talking about governance management, because it's certainly not cut and dry in many ways. No matter how much I sometimes feel like it is, it really isn't. We all have our individual towns that have a lot of personality and individualism to them. And so when folks call me with governance and management questions, it really is a lot of, well, it depends. And that can get really frustrating if you're looking for me to provide you with an answer, because oftentimes there isn't an answer. And then, like I said earlier, we have no direct jurisdiction, so we can give you guidance, but ultimately, oftentimes you are the ones who have to make the decisions, which is a really good thing, because it means you have a lot of flexibility and a lot of ability to be responsive to your local community, which is fantastic. So we're in the home stretch of today, and we're talking about one of the things I love the most, which is strategic planning. And people oftentimes ask me, well, what should we be doing for a strategic plan, or what process should we use, or what should our strategic plan look like? And in the past, I think the Department of Libraries had a very specific technique that they taught, and we've sort of walked back from that a little bit and are focusing more on making sure that you are crafting a plan to move your institution forward that will, number one, actually be useful, will be used by the director and the board and the library. So we don't want you to create something that you're just going to put in a binder and stick on a shelf. We want it to actually be a useful document. And number two, we want it to involve public input in some way that works for you. Now, I know this is a little challenging to think about right now. In the middle of the pandemic, it can be really hard to think about strategic planning, and I totally get that. In fact, I did a trustee training a few weeks ago where that was a lot of what we talked about, which is how do we think long term when we're just trying to figure out how to get through this pandemic now? Putting that aside, I want us to think about, as we move forward, part of what we're doing right now when we're trying to think about how to reopen and what things are going to look like in the future, we really are kind of strategic planning in the moment right now. And so how do we now, as we think through our immediate future or the next year, involve public input in what we're doing in some way? And then when we think longer term, we think about where the library is going in the next couple of years, how do we incorporate our public in that process so that we really are creating a plan that's responsive to our community and keeps us relevant to our community? Those are some of our challenges. So when you think about strategic planning, I encourage you to think two things. Let's create something we're actually going to use, and let's make sure that we figure out a way to involve our community in a way that works for us and our capacity as a board and a director team. So what's the point of a strategic plan? What do they help with? Well, they definitely can help you determine what programs and services and items to offer for your library. It can definitely help you evaluate the effectiveness of what you're doing as an institution. They can help you guide your advocacy. They can help you keep the library relevant, which is really important. They can help you, they can be very important to grant applications and funding requests, which I think we're all kind of thinking about right now. In a word, everything. And I know there are a lot of libraries in Vermont that don't have a strategic plan or haven't updated one in a while. And so I'd like to talk about this because I really feel like a strategic plan can help you focus. And it can help you turn outward and see what your community wants from you, and then bring that into the board and figure out, all right, this is what we're hearing. How do we focus our efforts in a way that is really responsive to what the community says it needs from us? So that we're not just trying this and that and this and that based on our whims or what we think. We're trying this and that based on how it responds to an expressed community need. And that way you can tie what you're doing directly to what you've heard from your community members is important to them. And that will help you with funding requests. It'll help you conserve your energy. It'll help you really justify for the community. Well, these are all the things we heard you guys wanted. Based on our resources, these are the things that we feel like we're going to focus on now. If you'd like us to do these other things, let's talk about the costs associated with that and see if that justifies an additional funding request. So it all sort of mushes together and comes together, hopefully, in a way that can not only support and guide what you do, but also justify to your taxpayers and donors why you feel like these things need to happen, not because you've come up with it, but because you're responding to what the community says it wants. So how do you know if your library meets the needs of its patrons? Well, I talk about community needs assessment as part of figuring that out. And there are many different ways to do this. There's sort of a data gathering way, as librarians like to do, and then there's a turning outward way to engage with the community. Excuse me. So when I talk to trustee boards and directors about community engagement and strategic planning, I recommend that they look at this sort of web that I have up on the slide right now and think about, where are the people in our community? What groups or meetings or gatherings tend to happen? And how connected are we to all of those things? So we look at, and I actually encourage boards and directors to sit down and actually make lists for each one of these little bubbles here. So what civic groups exist in our town, and really try to list all of them out. And if you think you're missing some, figure out who can you ask to help you complete that list. What religious groups exist in town? What social groups are there? And are there any that might exist we don't know about? And who might be able to help fill in our list for that? What are the nonprofit organizations? What are the local government folks and different committees? What are the parent and youth groups that exist? Do we have any businesses in town? Do we have business groups in town that we can connect with? And then are there places that people tend to go, like the dump? I mean, a lot of people in my town here in Essex Junction meet up at the transfer station, at the local park. Again, when we can meet again, of course. Stores, events, are there any community events? And really make as comprehensive of a list as you can about everything that happens in your town to help you look at the breadth and depth of community, what that means in your town. And all of the organizations, groups, places that you list are going to be places that you're going to want to try to connect with in some way as you do an assessment of your community and what it needs to help you in your planning process. So once you have that list, how do you figure out what your community needs? How do you engage with folks? And in Vermont, it's very much a who knows who sort of thing, right? So you can look at the makeup of your board and of your staff and of your volunteers and see, once you've got this huge list, who is connected to each one of these things. Can people sort of sign themselves up to connect with these groups or at these places? And if you have some blanks, like you have a certain group in town that you know about, but no one on the board and none of your volunteers and none of your staff are connected with that, you go to the next level of connection. Do any of us know anyone who's connected with this group? Or do any of us know anyone who knows anyone who's connected with this group? And really talk about that to figure out how you can pull those strings to somehow get introduced or to ask someone to volunteer for the library in a way of just connecting you with this group somehow. Really think through that strategically about how you're going to connect with each group, because again, these are all patrons of yours or community members, taxpayers who are supporting you, or potential donors. And you really want to make sure that you connect with them in some way, because you exist for everyone in your community, not just your regular users. So you start thinking about, well, if we want to connect with our community and find out their needs, do we potentially have some focus groups of some sort, some community conversations, either online in this time of the pandemic, or when we can get back together again? Do we have some sort of invitation where we invite people to come to the library or come to some space to talk about our community needs? Do we have some sort of survey that we can send out? And surveys tend to be what we fall back on, but they can be challenging to create in a meaningful way and to get meaningful answers. So figuring out, how you create a meaningful survey is a challenge. And then how do you want to administer that and where? So that's something to think about. Do you want to have folks actually go out into the community and talk to people, go to the grocery store, the coffee shop, farmers market, community events, and have everyone sign up for one of these community events that they'll go to ask questions of folks and get the temperature of what people think the community needs? Do you go directly to the community meetings? Like if you've got a Rotary Club in town, or if there's a Rotary Club in a neighboring town that your residents go to, Rotary is always looking for speakers. So how can you get on the speaker list? Can you speak at the PTA? Can you speak at church groups? How can you get invited to these meetings to chat with people? And then as you start thinking through all that, the board also needs to think, what questions are you going to ask once you connect with people? How are you going to ask them? And then who is the best person to be doing that asking? Is it, the person who's connected on the board? Or is that connected person the one who gets the meeting and then brings someone along to do the asking? Really thinking through all that. And so when I encourage people to start thinking about this, I also encourage them to be thinking when they have these conversations with folks about asking your taxpayers, what are the current and future needs of your community, as opposed to asking about the current and future needs of the library. And I ask you, why is this important to do? And I think our instinct is to ask people, well, what do you want from your library? Or what is the library missing? And I think what you're going to get back on that may be a little limited, because people might not know what you already offer, or they might tell you things that they think you want to hear. Whereas if you ask what the current and future needs of your community are, people tend to know what they think their town needs and might have something that they can bring up. And then it's our challenge as the library experts to bring back what we hear and figure out what we're going to do with that information. And so as you start engaging with people and asking what your town needs, and hopefully as you're doing this, you've connected with town leaders to let them know that you're doing this. Number one, just to see if it's already been done, so you can crib off what's already been done, which is great. And number two, so that to understand why you're doing this. They don't think you're stepping on their toes. But you start getting ideas back, and you and the board needs to sit down and think which of these community needs should and can be addressed by the library given our limitations of funding and staff. Because you'll find some of these things, and they might bring up some new ideas, things you might not have thought about. That would really address a deep community need, but you wouldn't necessarily have put that as part of your strategic plan or put that as part of your focus had you not heard that from this community member or this community group. And then you're also going to get a pot of answers that the library could partner with other organizations in town to meet those needs, and thus really extend the library's influence and reach out, because you're creating new or innovative partnerships with community members or community organizations in ways that allow taxpayers and donors to see you doing strategic partnerships, which a lot of donors and taxpayers really like to see. So you're not sort of reinventing the wheel, you're finding an innovative way to partner up with someone else in the community. And then you'll also get some needs that don't make any sense for the library to address. And that gives you an opportunity as an information professional and as good stewards of information to pass those ideas off to whomever it makes sense to receive them. And so again, you're building community and you're building your library's sense of usefulness in the community by transferring these ideas to the select board or to some sort of committee in town. Now, how do you figure out which needs the library should meet, which needs the library should partner on, and which needs you need to pass off? That's part of your visioning and strategic planning process to figure that out. And that's where you sort of come together as a board and really hash through what you're hearing as you're hearing these things. So on this slide, I've given you some examples of ways to do what I've just talked about. The Harwood Institute I've been trained in, I love talking about. Their whole thing is this turning outward process and engage the community in this process I've just kind of gone through. And they see it as an iterative process, which means you go out, you bring stuff back in, you go back out, and you do it multiple rounds. And the American Library Association worked with the Harwood Institute to develop this turning outward tool for libraries, and that link is on this slide and it will be in your handouts. The Aspen Institute, pretty famous institute, they came up with an action guide a few years ago, which is also tells you how to do this process in a different way. I encourage you to look through these tools and figure out which of these might work best for you. And then on our website, we have a bunch of strategic plans from libraries throughout the state, of libraries of different sizes, but also plans of different types. Everything from a single page series of vision statements or purpose statements for a library that was based on what they heard from the community, to a 20-page detailed plan with examples and outcomes and all that sort of stuff. And again, each library needs to create something that will be useful for them and that will work for them going forward.
Laura, there's some good questions in the chat, and then there's also a comment from Bridget recommending the county health rankings and the local YRBS. I'm not sure what YRBS is. Bridget, if you could write that out, that'd be great. But she says it's health related in terms of needs, but can show isolation. Young people need a support. That's a great
Absolutely.
suggestion.
Yeah, and one of the slides I didn't put in this presentation, I oftentimes talk about the American Community Survey, which is sort of a detailed survey done every few years in between the census years of small towns. And that can be a really great place to get some funky and interesting information about your town, to learn about like how many of the houses are homeowners versus renters, education level of people in your town. So it's a great way to gather some data too. In addition to asking other groups in town, have they already done a community needs assessment that you can crib off from? Or has the town done a town plan that you can crib off from in part of this planning process?
And then there was also a request, is there anything, simple 10-question like template sort of community needs survey for libraries that haven't done this before? And then the question of what if your board doesn't seem interested in doing a strategic plan? Where do you go from there?
Yeah, I'm going to take that second question first. So yeah, if your board is not interested in doing a strategic planning or community needs assessment of any type, it means that they've decided that they're not interested in doing whatever they think that process means, or they're not interested in doing a large part of what their job is. So I think one of the things you could do is you could invite me to come and chat with them, because I think how what I've just talked about gets translated into your community depends on your community. Like I had a training with the Waterbury trustees several months ago where we went through this process, and as we were talking through this, they realized, you know, a lot of organizations in our community have already done a community needs assessment. How about we just as a board split up and gather all those materials together and then look at those together as a board and then just use that to write our strategic plan or to write some guidance statements for ourselves, rather than doing a lot of community meetings, because they realized that a whole bunch of people had already done that, and so they don't need to waste their energy doing that. I've had another board say to me, you know, the town just did a new town plan that talks about the library. How about we look at what that says and figure out how we want to put that as part of our strategic plan? And then I also encourage boards to realize that strategic plans don't need to be 5-year plans or 3-year plans. They could be 1-year plans. They could be, what are we going to do over the next year? And then we're going to reassess that every year. Or it's a 5-year plan that they look at every 1 year just to make sure that it continues to remain relevant. Or I could just talk to them about why strategic plans are important. You know, the library has so much it could do. It really needs some sort of plan to help direct it, because you really are limited in terms of staff, time, and money. And if you don't have a plan and you're just sort of doing one-offs here and there, that makes it harder for funders to want to fund you. And what was the first question, Joy? Oh, 10 questions?
Yeah,
10 questions.
Example questions.
Yeah.
Sort of starter questions.
Yeah. So the link that's on the slide right now, the ALA Turning Outward Tools for Libraries, they have a guide there that talks about having the whole community engagement conversation series process. But as part of that guide, there's one page where they have like 10 questions that you can ask people. Now, how effective those would be for a survey, you definitely have to modify them if you wanted to do a survey. But if you wanted a list of 10 questions to look at that might help you get your brain around what this might look like, or the types of questions that might elicit some useful responses, I encourage you to look at that, because those questions by the Harvard Institute were very carefully developed to help get people to think deeply about what their community needs and help them get beyond surface stuff to really dive deeper to figure out what's really going on in our community that the library could actually have some real impact on. So yeah, look at the American Library Association Turning Outward Tools for Libraries page, and look for that Community Conversations workbook. That should be helpful if you're interested in that process.
And then there's also a question about whether the strategic plans and mission statements should be made public.
Absolutely. Yep, they should. And the reason you want to make them public is because, especially if you've created them with community engagement, you want the community to see that you've listened to them and that your plan reflects what you heard from them. But it also, when you start doing funding requests, ideally you tie those funding requests to your strategic plan. So you can say, hey, we heard this from you, we created this plan, now this is how we want to fund it. Will you be our partner in funding this thing that you told us that you wanted? All right, are there other? So I want to really open it up to questions from folks about this or anything else that we've covered. It is now 11:36, which is great. That means we have lots of time for questions that people want. If you're getting ready to tune out, if your brain's feeling a little full, up on the last slide here, we have a survey, project outcome that we'd love you to fill out. I think, Joy, you'll probably send this out over email too. But we really would love your feedback on this. These online presentations really are experiments for us at this point. We haven't done a lot of them over time. I have never done this completely online before for library directors, so this is really exciting for me and library staff. Please fill out that survey. You've got my contact information there, and Joy's contact information and her email. But yeah, if you have any questions before you leave or start completely tuning out, please put them in the chat box. Joy and I will monitor that, because I want to make sure that you get your questions answered. And if you do need to bail off and go off to lunch or enjoy the sunshine outside, thank you again for joining us. It's really awesome. All right. I'm going to start with Erica's question just because it popped up, Joy, but if there are ones before this, please let me know. So Erica says just more of a comment than a question. She's looking for some questions for a survey. Yep. And you're the only employee, you don't have time to create something from scratch. So, and you want to create something with answers that you can use. Yeah. So again, Erica, I would suggest looking at the Harvard questions and seeing how you might want to modify those. And you can also send them to me if you'd like. If you develop something and you want to get some feedback, I'm absolutely willing to give you feedback on that, because I've gotten some training in survey writing. And the big thing for me with survey questions, the biggest mistakes I tend to see is that people are asking, number one, questions in a way that that sort of guides people to a certain answer, which is not what you want. Or they're asking questions where they can't clearly articulate what they're going to do with the answers to those questions. So it's really important as you design a survey to each question has a purpose for you, and you know if people answer that question, what you're going to do with that information. So if you're asking demographic information, you want to make sure you're asking only the demographic information questions that you think you're actually going to use for some reason. And if you don't think you'll actually use the demographic information, then don't ask that question. That's just one quick example. But yes, you can absolutely email me survey questions and ask for feedback. I do that a lot. And yes, we will, for folks asking for copies of these slides with the links, we will send them out. And Joy has put the evaluation link in the chat, so you can click right on that. But we will send these slides out so you can have a summary of what we talked about today, and then all of those links at the end. Absolutely. Joy's also put her handouts, her email in the chat for handouts. And I'm just going to scroll through and see if there are any questions I've missed. If you asked a question earlier that we never got to or inadvertently missed, you could type it again in the chat box just to make sure, because I really, really don't want to miss any of your questions. And I want to re-emphasize that that your strategic plan, again, doesn't need to be a really long, complex, detailed document, unless that's going to be helpful for you and your trustees. Again, if that's really going to, if you're having the outcome statements and tasks associated is helpful to you guys, I encourage you to go that route. But one of the example strategic plans on our website is from the Charlotte Public Library, which is it's a medium-sized library for Vermont. And they had some community conversations and one-on-one conversations with folks over a period of a few months. And then they created a one-page document that had, I think, 4 focus statements for their library. And everything that they do is tied to one or more of those focus statements. And they look at that document frequently just to make sure that they're still on the right path. But they're like inspirational guidance statements that I think for that library, Margaret, the director there, says it works really, really well for them and the trustees and for their town. But they base all their funding requests on those 4 statements, and all their programming goes to those 4 statements. So it's, it can be as not simple. That's not simple in any way, but as focused as that, or as succinct as that. And that also, she loves it because it also doubles as a handout that she can give people. And she has, documents behind that, which show all the data that those statements were drawn from, so people can see that data if they want. But if they're just interested in, why is the library doing this? Why are they focused on this? They can clearly point to one of these one or more of these 4 focus statements. So if you're looking for something really succinct, I encourage you to check out the Charlotte Library Strategic Plan. It's posted on our website. And it looks like Bridget posted what her acronym meant, Youth Behavior Risk Survey, which the state does. And she put out some details about that in the chat for folks who are interested. Well, it's 11:42, and I don't see any new questions, but folks, I'm here for you. So if anything comes to mind in the next few minutes, please feel free to send them our way. We'll continue to put links. It looks like Joy just put Charlotte Library Strategic Plan in the chat. So excellent. But yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and Joy with questions about any of this. As you can tell, we love this work. We love working with libraries on this sort of stuff. We went over a lot today, quite a few things. Thank you all for your patience and perseverance through these almost 2 hours that we had together. I sincerely hope that you're engaging in self-care and keeping in communication with your library staff, your library trustees, your town folks, your donors. We are all in this together, honestly. We're figuring it out. We're muddling through it together. And please let us know how we can be helpful to you now and in the future moving forward. I think it's really important to both me and Joy and actually everyone here at the department that we're as helpful to you as possible. And so we try to be as responsive as possible given the guidelines we have to follow as state workers. But please feel free to reach out now and in the future. And thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I just said thanks, Laura.
Oh, I just heard my name. Oh, thank you. All right, Joy, should we stop the recording?